Welcome to our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of Our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on our website, ourworldheritage.org. Thank you for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful event.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to each of you. I welcome you to this webinar that is part of a global initiative to discuss UNESCO Convention, heritage themes, and beyond all this, heritage in a global basis. This month is dedicated to the new heritage approaches theme. And first of all, I would like to thank Monica Schle and Vera Tangari from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for organizing this month activities along with all the other partners. I am Flavia Brito. I am from the School of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of São Paulo, Brazil, and I'll be today's session moderator. Today, we'll discuss on this session 12, modern, contemporary, and future heritage. Modern heritage has been on the agenda of preservation policy since the 80s, gaining strength in the 1990s. Despite many advances, the time barrier remains a challenge to think about the practices and meaning of this heritage in contemporary times. Intervention, authenticity, and authorship are themes that need to be discussed in order to carry out the preservation policies and practice that contemplate modern and contemporary heritage in its complexity and inclusive way. For the future and heritage of future generations, it will be increasingly important to consider the agendas of local identity, social participation, and sustainability. Questioning or not, maybe we'll discuss this today, the authorized heritage discourses. So to discuss this most important and forthcoming theme in heritage debates, I have the great honor and to welcome our three speakers for today. Cornelius Holstorff is a UNESCO Chair on Heritage Futures, Linus University in Kalmar, Sweden, and he will speak which heritage will benefit future generations. Nivaldo Andrade Jr. from Brazil, is associate professor at the University Federal of Bahia in Brazil, and he will speak about the challenges for the conservation of modern, contemporary, and future heritage in Brazil. And finally, Humberto Bonomo from Chile will speak about the common space, the future of common space in modern housing. Humberto is director of the Center of Cultural Heritage at the Catholic University in Chile, where he also teaches. So with no further ado, I will pass the floor to our speakers that will speak in the order that I've presented them. And so please welcome and join me in welcoming Professor Cornelius Holstroff. So I leave the floor with you, and you have to give the announcements, please, that people have to see you in a certain way that I'm not sure of which it is. So please,
okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Flavia. Thanks, everybody, for having me here and giving us a chance to discuss together these important issues. As you can see, I will not be sharing my screen, but talk like this. So you see this best if you put your view on speaker's view, and then I think everything should be fine. Okay, so as Flavia said, I'm representing Linnaeus University in Sweden, and within that, our UNESCO chair on heritage futures. Now, the topic I chose for this presentation is which heritage will benefit future generations. And this involves possibly a few new approaches, which is the idea of this series of discussions that we are having here. So I want to get right into that and also give you some examples of how this could be done or what it could involve. And then I envisage then we will have some possibly controversial discussion about this afterwards. So the first thing one obviously has to wonder about is what can we actually know about the future? Because I'm not claiming that I have any privileged knowledge about the future that nobody else would have. So this is obviously a key question, but there are a few things that we can say about the future and that are not even particularly controversial, I would argue. Now, the first thing, and maybe the most important thing, is that the future will be unlike the present. I think that is the most profound insight one can have about the future. And yet it is very difficult to take this to heart. And that is true both in our personal lives, but also as a society. We are designed to assume that tomorrow will be like today and so on. And of course, in a short distance, that is true. But in the longer term, it is not. And as we look back in history, then we see many examples for the fundamental changes that have happened during the course of human history. So the risk is that we are caught in what I call presentism, so that we assume that the present will last forever. And we should try as much as we can to liberate ourselves from this presentism. And that involves not to assume that the future needs and desires resemble our own. That doesn't mean it's very easy to say what will be future people's needs and desires. But let's not assume that they are the same of what we recognize is the case today. This means we must examine our anticipatory assumptions about the future. There are very often things we just take for granted. We just assume that they will always be the way they are now because they make perfect sense to us. And yet they are based on assumptions that we just adopt, just assume to be the case. So we should build a capacity to question these assumptions that we first become aware of them and then question the assumptions that we all make about the future. There's a word for that which the UNESCO is using in a particular context, and that's futures literacy. That is what is required, that we become aware of the assumptions we make about the future, and that there's a whole range of different options and different possible futures ahead of us where we can make decisions and choices in which direction we wish to travel as a society or even as humanity. For that, we need to try and keep an open mind. And sort of that is maybe the most important skill that we need to liberate ourselves from all the many assumptions that we make. Right. So what can we anticipate about the future? Because it's easy to claim that we are caught in the present, which of course we are. But is there anything we can know about the future? The first thing we need to recognize is that, which future are you talking about? because as we look back in the past, it's quite a difference if we're talking about last year or 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And of course, the same is true for the future. So it starts by recognizing that futures differ. And that we need to decide which future are we addressing in what we're doing. And this is not something that needs much discussion. And we are also used to that in daily life. We realize when we address our children, then what time perspective that has. And when we talk about climate change, then this is a longer time perspective, is also beyond doubt. So it's a question of becoming aware that there are timescales in the future that we need to make distinctions about and discuss in separate terms. Now, I want to give you two examples for this sort of discussion we should have in the heritage sector, specifically regarding cultural heritage. And I'm not claiming I have the definitive answers, but I just want to raise the issues as issues that I think we need to address together. And that we should agree on as a community of scholars or professionals in order to find the best strategy in also, of course, in different specific contexts that we may be working with. So here's one anticipation that I think doesn't have to be particularly controversial. Now, I would claim that climate change and population growth, which are well documented, will increase pressure on land for many decades to come. So we're talking about a future of several decades ahead, maybe less than 100 years or so. We can't be sure on exactly what things will be like in 100 years or more, but between sort of now and then there are curves of demographic development, and there are also curves of climate change that are clear trends. And we can assume that the pressure on land will be higher rather than lower in the future for a range of different reasons. It's not just the masses of the numbers of the population, but it's also the subsistence that is needed and the food that needs to be produced. Now, if this is an assumption we can make an anticipation that is based on the data we have about climate development and also demographic developments, then we can think about, well, what kind of possibly new heritage approaches should be adopted with the best interests of future generations in mind. What should we do today in relation to heritage in order to create conditions that will meet the needs of people for whom pressure on land is higher in the future than it is now? Well, here's a suggestion which I think we should at least discuss together, although I realize that it is controversial. But I think one possibility to address this challenge is that we should disassociate people's identities and cultural heritage from the notion of land. Because that creates difficulties when people are wedded to the land very firmly, and when cultural heritage supports that and makes these links even stronger, then it will be difficult to accommodate other land users, other people that the land may have to be shared with. And I'm talking globally here, not on specific places. Obviously, these things will look very different depending on which area in the world you're talking about. But on the whole, I think we realize that some areas will not be inhabitable in the future, and other areas will not be livable because the climatic conditions will not favor subsistence agriculture in the future. So some movement has to happen, and throughout the world, this is not helped by this connection between heritage and identity and the land. Right, now this is a controversial suggestion, but I think it is one that we need to address and critically discuss. Now I have a second suggestion, a second anticipation. Now, and this is also based on data. I don't have time now to go into that, but if you look at the development of conflicts in which people die over the since the Second World War, basically, then there's a very clear trend. which I think also we recognize, even if we haven't seen the statistics. Up until the Second World War, most conflicts, military conflicts, were between nations, with everything that involved national armies fighting each other. And of course, the Second World War is a good example for that. So that's the context in which UNESCO was created, and in which the idea of the collaboration between nations was very significant, and of course intended to support peace and trust and understanding between the people in different nations. Now, since then, we see a very different trend. There are still conflicts, but they've changed in nature. And most of the conflicts today, and the trend is so that we can assume that this will not suddenly stop, but it will continue for several decades into the future. Most of the conflicts already today, they are cultural and ethnic. They may involve state parties, but they also involve different parties. And Syria is a good example where you see a government involved, but also all sorts of religious groups and cultural groups that are drawn in to this military conflict that we've seen over the last decade or so. It's that sort of conflicts that we are seeing today, and that we're probably going to be faced with a great deal over the coming decades as well. Now, if the UNESCO system and the World Heritage System was designed to facilitate peace and understanding between nations, well, what is the answer to this different kind of conflicts that we're seeing today? That is the challenge that I think we need to discuss in the heritage sector, and I haven't seen very many discussions of this, even though the figures are undisputed. You can just count that. It's official statistics from the UN and so on. And I think we should get into this discussion. What could one do? Here's one suggestion for a new approach that is, well, it's not the definitive answer, but it's one way of addressing that. Well, I think we need one way to solve this is that we should be promoting shared rather than distinct heritage between these different cultural and ethnic groups that sometimes are in conflict with each other. So at the moment, it's the case that heritage is very much one way in which groups distinguish themselves from each other. So either you're part of this group or you're part of that group. And that means you have a different identity and a different history and maybe different sites and different intangible heritage that is significant to you. Now that reaffirms you in your particular identity. And in some cases, of course, not in all of them, but in some extreme cases, this will worsen the animosities between different groups, and it will certainly not help to create understanding between groups, but rather, if anything, rather incinerate conflicts. So we could try to propose to promote a different kind of heritage, one that seeks commonalities between different groups, because these commonalities, they always exist as well if you look for them. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all humans, and we share so much more than what separates us. So one could also focus on neighbors who may live in similar regions, same geographical conditions often. They may share some of the same food. They may have some of the same history if you go back long enough. There may be all kinds of similarities. And if we emphasize those, then I think it would be easier to find what people share with each other and emphasize that in the heritage rather than the distinctiveness. And of course, that is also something that would require changes in the World Heritage System, which I know are impossible to do in practice. But it would require a system where it's not the nations that govern denominations, but different mechanisms that is actually supporting finding similarities and commonalities between different groups. Right, so I'm almost coming to the end of my time here. The conclusion I want to draw from that is not that everybody should do as I've suggested, absolutely not, but it is that we should address these issues and we should take the future more seriously in heritage, because at the moment there is very little discussion on exactly how which trends we see for the future and what do we anticipate and how do we think heritage will make a contribution to different futures that we can identify ahead of us. So let's take a new approach and take the future seriously, apply foresight in heritage studies and heritage management. And that is, of course, the task that the UNESCO Chair on Heritage Futures is dealing with. And I thought I'll leave you here with the definition of heritage futures, because it is a term that is a bit abstract and not commonly used yet. So we define heritage futures as the roles of heritage in managing the relations between present and future societies. And I think the examples I gave you today, there are two examples for how one can do that, what it might mean. Of course, many other examples, different things, what one could also do. But it's about what we do today and how this will impact on the future and what is the best way forward in relation to heritage in that context. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cornelius, for these thoughts and provocations on the heritage futures. And I'll pass straight away to Nivaldo Andrade from Federal University of Bahia. And thank you very much, Nivaldo, for being with us and sharing your thoughts and researches.
Thank you, Flavia. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone, everywhere. I'm going to share my screen. I'm not sure if you're already seeing it. Please confirm, Flavia. Can you see it? I'd like to thank Monica for the invitation.
Yes, it's perfect. We can see it.
I'd like to thank Monica for the invitation. My speech will be very different from Cornelius, because I'm going to present some reflections on the history of conservation of modern and contemporary architecture in Brazil, the last situations we are living the last years, and some reflections at the end on how we can face that. Many of you know, because I've seen that there are many Brazilians that are following us, but for the ones who are not familiar with the history, Brazil is very particular, the history of conservation of heritage in Brazil, because the same architects that were creating modern architecture were in charge of preserving architecture from the 30s, from the 1930s, when the National Heritage Institute, IFAM, was created. So, for example, Lúcio Costa, who is the picture, was at the same time responsible for some important achievements on modern architecture in Brazil, like the second visit of Le Corbusier in 1936 to help in design the Ministry of Education and Health building in Rio, the Capanema Palace with Brazilian architects, as well as he's the author of the Plan of Brasilia. He was the person in charge of the listing department at the National Heritage Institute from its beginning in 37 to 72. Brazil was allegedly the first country in the world to declare modern buildings that were, by the time, contemporary buildings, just open, just finished, as national heritage. Another character, another actor that had an important role in this history was Oscar Niemeyer, who also worked at IFAM, at the National Heritage Institute, for a short period, and his masterpieces were listed by IFAM from 47 on, following the international recognition of his work. The first building, the first modern building to be listed in Brazil was a Niemeyer designed one, that was St. Francis Church at Pampulha, that was listed only 5 years before it was finished, before it was even used as a church, as the Archbishop didn't accept to perform masses in this church. It was inscribed recently in the World Heritage List 5 years ago, and many other buildings by Oscar Niemeyer and the other architects from Rio that were around Lúcio Costa influence and leadership were listed. For example, 1 year later in 48, then the Gustavo Capanema Palace. Some buildings were listed even before they were finished, such as the Brasilia Cathedral, before it had its surfaces in glass that closed the space, as well as Flamengo Park in Rio, that was listed before it was accomplished. Brasilia, the plan of Lúcio Costa for Brasilia was listed 3 years after being inscribed in World Heritage List, and that put also Brazil as a pioneer in the conservation not only of modern architecture but also of modern urban design or urban planning. Many others buildings were listed in the last years. Now we are talking about 60 buildings and squares and urban designs that were built from the 30s, the late 20s to the 60s and 70s. And lately, in the last years, also some recent buildings like by Lina Bobardi, for example, like the Oficina Theater in São Paulo that was finished in 94, was listed 20 years later, and Sesc Pompeia that was listed 6 years ago, less than 30 years after its completion. Another discussion is about how to restore these buildings. Even if Brazil was the first country in the world to declare as national monument modern buildings, the discussion, the debates on how to restore it are recent. In the last 20 years, we have seen a lot of interesting experiences and discussions on how to preserve authenticity and integrity, etc., in these buildings. This is the restoration of Pedregulho, the most important housing complex in Brazil that has been a reference for many housing complex designs, even in Italy, for example, Corviale in Rome, and Dicione in Genova. It has been restored recently. Flavia, who is chairing this session, has worked a lot in starting this building and also with Alfredo Brito in its restoration. It's very interesting to see that Brazil, even with all the problems, was able to restore this huge housing complex. It was not completely restored, only the most important building, the largest one on the upper side of the hill. But when we think that, for example, the United Kingdom has destroyed, has demolished Robin Hood Gardens by the couple Smith recently, I think this is good news, for example. It's a good experience that comes from Brazil, even if we can discuss the theme of authenticity as the bricks, the cobogos, these hollowed bricks, were redone, rebuilt. There are many other buildings, modern important buildings, listed buildings that has been restored in Brazil in the last years, not only São Paulo, Rio, and Brasília, that are the cities that houses most of those buildings, but also in Fortaleza, Salvador, Recife, and Belo Horizonte, just to name some of them. Nevertheless, we have many important buildings, especially those built from the 80s on, that are really being abandoned, destroyed, demolished, or mischaracterized. For example, the pilot project of Lina Bobardi to Ladeira da Misericórdia, a slope that connects the lower city and the upper city of Salvador, my hometown. That is a very interesting intervention held by Lina in the 80s that became a reference on how to insert new architecture in ruins that are in the historic center of Salvador, that was recently inscribed by the time in the World Heritage List. The inscription of Salvador in the World Heritage List happened 1 year before the beginning of this design in 85. This building is abandoned for many years, even if it's only 100 or 200 meters from the city hall in the historic center of Salvador. The slope is closed for the people, and the buildings are being abandoned and taken by the vegetation, by the green, which is not something that Lina didn't want it to happen in a certain way. Other buildings that are abandoned, for example, Severiano Porto developed a very interesting way of designing contemporary architecture with traditional materials like the wood in the Amazon forest. He was the most important architect in the Amazon region in the 70s and 80s, and this is his masterpiece that is completely abandoned, as we can see on the upper right side photo. The mischaracterization also arrives in some of the most important buildings. Those are some newspapers text that shows that the Museum of Modern Art of Bahia, the first intervention Lina held in the heritage in the 60s, that also became a reference not only in Brazil but worldwide, how to intervene in a former industrial building, has received this pier in concrete that recently, this picture has less than 1 week, by Sueli Figueiredo, because the museum is being treated more as a space for receiving tourists and music shows, as we can see in the other picture, more than as the most important museum of modern art of Bahia and one of the most important of Brazil. This has been a very polemical, a very controversial discussion in Brazil in recent years. And another mischaracterization, also recent, is the former store Paulo Mendes da Rocha, the Pritzker Prize winner architect from São Paulo, that passed away like 3 or 4 weeks ago. One of his most interesting buildings from the 80s, the former store, a store of design furniture, was refurbished recently, and it changed a lot while using this red color in many of the elements, as well as in the main facade, a very controversial intervention. This building has no protection, is not listed by national government or by São Paulo government or by São Paulo City Hall. And in my hometown, not in my hometown, but very close to my hometown, in a beach in the north of Salvador, Gaetano Pesce, the Italian architect and designer who lives between New York and Strasbourg, he bought this property like 20 years ago, designed this house as a vacation house for him and his family. I have worked in the building of this house when I was recently graduated from the School of Architecture. And recently we were trying to list it. It's not very common in Brazil, the listing of contemporary architecture, but we are about to list it. The City Hall of Camaçari was about to list it when it was demolished in a weekend. So we lost an interesting, a very experimental architecture designed by one of the most famous designers and architects of the world. The last part of my presentation, and I'm arriving to some reflections, is about the future heritage. As there was this provocation in the title of the session. Brazil has very interesting examples of how to insert contemporary architecture inside historic sites. Here is Ouro Preto, also inscribed in the World Heritage List, one of the first cities in Brazil, maybe the first one to be inscribed in the World Heritage List in the 80s, that received in the end of the 30s this hotel, this building in the left side, this horizontal building in the middle of the hill, designed by Oscar Niemeyer while working at IFAM, at the National Heritage Institute, that proved that modern architecture at the time could be also establish a dialogue with the historic city. Lina Bobardi, Ladeira da Misericórdia pilot project that I have shown you in Salvador also shows us these possibilities. In France, we have many examples. The Beaubourg Centre Georges Pompidou maybe is the most famous one of how to insert a building that can change and enhance the uses and the occupation of historic site in the center of Paris, close to the Marais, that is contemporary to the law number 7072 from 1770, the law on architecture, that says that architectural creation and their harmonious integration into the surrounding environment are of public interest. There is in France for more than 40 years, there is a law that was changed but maintains the same idea in recent years, that architectural creation and architectural creation, new architecture inside historic sites are of public interest. In Brazil, however, the National Heritage Institute many times puts the obligation of using traditional materials and traditional shapes while inserting new architecture in historic sites. So many parts of Ouro Preto, of this city, were built after Ouro Preto was listed in 37, 38, I think, but uses the same architecture. So it's impossible to distinguish between the new architecture that was built after the listing and the architecture that exists there since the 18th century, for example. So in the last years, another discussion in Brazil, in my hometown in Salvador, is about the city hall that was built in only 15 days in 1986 in the oldest square of the city, the square where the city hall was always there since the foundation of the city in 1549. This building was designed by João Filgueiras Lima, Lelé, a brilliant Brazilian architect that worked with Oscar Niemeyer in building many of his buildings in Brasilia, helped him a lot, helped Lina Bobardi in the design of the Ladeira da Misericórdia pilot project that I've shown you. And this city hall that has these colors, these very brilliant colors, this cylinder in yellow that houses the air conditioning system, and also elements in blue and red. In the tower, in the back, you can see the tower in green that houses the stairs. It has been painted in white with the authorization of the architect. It helped to diminish the contrast with the surrounding buildings, but the city hall has been discussing the demolition of this building. They say the dismantlement of this building and its building in another site, but they don't say which site would that be. And the Brazilian Institute of Architects, the Faculty of Architecture of the Federal University of Bahia, and other institutions have started a discussion about maintaining it, even if not anymore as the city hall, because it's very small, it doesn't fit the demands, but as an interpretation center for the historic center of Salvador, and the mayor of Salvador is about to accept it. I think he will understand the importance of this building that is very criticized by people who is not architects, but loved by people who loves the insertion of contemporary architecture in the historic center. So to finish, the trends that we can highlight here are, although Brazil was allegedly the first country in the world in the 40s to list modern buildings that by then were contemporary buildings, the list of recent buildings stopped in the 60s and focuses now on modern buildings. The last years, we are not listing recent buildings that were built in the last 20 or 30 years, as Ifan did in his first years. We are only listing buildings that are already canonical from the 60s, from the 50s, from the 40s. Although Brazil has a 70-year tradition of safeguarding modern heritage, the discussion and experiences on the restoration of these assets only emerged in the last 20 years. Important masterpiece of contemporary architecture, as I've shown you, is being destroyed by abandonment, mischaracterization, or demolition. And the urban regulations to listed sites adopted by Brazilian and local governments are so strict that they practically preclude the emergence of good contemporary architecture, which could constitute the future heritage. So some recommendations, we could have many more, are Brazilian and local governments, with the support of universities and professional organizations, should promote strategies for the protection not only of modern architecture, but also contemporary architecture. And the urban regulations to listed sites adopted by Brazilian and local governments should foresee and not preclude the emergence of good contemporary architecture, which could constitute the future heritage or the heritage for the future. Oscar Niemeyer with the Grand Hotel in Ouro Preto, Lina Bobardi with her designs in the historic center of Salvador, in Lelé with the City Hall of Salvador, proved that it's possible to create good contemporary architecture inside listed sites. Thank you very much, and sorry if I have talked too much and not respected the time. Thank you.
That's very fine, Nivaldo. No worries. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation on the Brazilian scene on modern and maybe future heritages. And thank you so much. And I'll leave the floor to Humberto Bonomi, to whom I welcome on behalf of New Heritage Approaches. Thank you, Humberto, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Flavia. Thank you, Nivaldo and Cornelius, to be here, Monica and Vera, to coordinate all the month dedicated to New Heritage Approaches. I'm going to share my screen. Some seconds to be prepared. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to read because of the time and to be precise with the language. That is not my favorite option. The presentation is called "The Common Space Project: The Future of Common Space in Modern Housing." The city has traditionally been understood as the dichotomous confrontation between private space of the dwelling and the public space of the city. However, in recent years, studies focusing on the analysis of another condition of the space, the common space, have multiplied. This is probably because the idea of the common has returned to the part of the discussion that underlie architecture, urbanism, sociology, and anthropology, and because these ideas reflects the way in which we live together. The idea of the common is an important value for our society, and forgotten and scarcely valued in the academic and political discussion. In this presentation, it's proposed that the idea of the common is a valuable an approach to the architectural, urban, and social heritage of the great neighborhood unit of the 20th century. This dissertation explores the spatial and formal characteristic of these exemplary experiences of modern architecture and urban planning, discusses the challenges they are facing and their potential in understanding the common space as a field of future project and a new heritage approach that it's important to preserve. When the concept of the common is analyzed, both from the field of architecture and from the other social science and humanities, it's possible to notice how quickly the fields of meaning linked to these terms flourish. The idea, the contribution of the historiography on the great modern housing complexes do not identify the significant value that the common space has in the radical operation of urban design and architecture. In these writings, normally, these proposals are referred to as a collective housing project insert in vast green recreational areas for the inhabitants of the new housing complexes. What is suggested here is that the neighborhood unit of the 40 and the 70 not only revolutionized the image of the city by providing new scales to the housing factory, they meant an even greater revolution due to the fact of capturing the common space as a new urban dimension, an intermediate place of diffuse ownership and articulated governance. The common space of the modern neighborhood unit is probably one of the most important inventions of modern architecture, and very probably also one of the weakest and misunderstood flanks of this radical project for the metropolis. The origin of the concept of the neighborhood unit go back to the work developed by Clarence Stein and Henry White in Radbourne in 28 and by Clarence Perry in 29. From Perry's theoretical and practical definition of the 30s until the 70s, the neighborhood unit that were built throughout the Western world is a series of, there is a series of common basic elements, principles. The first one is that the neighborhood unit is a residential neighborhood with community green areas. The second one is that the neighborhood unit is a relatively autonomous urban cell. The car, the third one, is that the car has a reduced traffic and slow speed to protect the pedestrian life of the inhabitants. The fourth is that it has equipment and basic school for the community of families that inhabit it. And the school is the place where the children meet, articulating new communities, ties that involve parents. And the last one, the fifth, is that the dimension vary between 400 and 800 meters, a convenient distance that be covered on foot in around 15 minutes. The 5 points just mentioned synthesize the main functional characteristic of this innovative-based urban structure. José Luis Sert has a really relevant role in the configuration of the neighborhood unit on the second post-war, introducing the use of block without contradicting the basic point just mentioned. In the neighborhood units of the second post-war, the use of the apartment block or the tower in the later cases impacts on the occupation of the land, on the amount and availability of the common space for recreation, on the location of community facilities in the property system, and therefore in the governance models of said urban realities. In the second post-war neighborhood unit, the Garden City, layouts were replaced by green areas not crossed by vehicular streets, and therefore configuring macro blocks penetrated with only by pedestrian access pathways on the apartment buildings. The literature has extensively analyzed the morphological and urban characteristic of neighborhood unit from 40 to 70. However, in our opinion, what has not been sufficiently described are the property system of the large neighborhood unit at this time. In our opinion, the most relevant are two. The first is related to the rental of the apartment when the projects are owned by the state, which builds and maintains them over time. And the second one is the model it is one that has spread in the most important way in Latin America and refers to the project built by participation of public and private capitals with a mortgage system. To install heavily the idea of ownership in many countries in Latin America, the well-known horizontal property laws or co-ownership laws were approved. This fact must be considered really fundamental because suppose that the model of administration, ownership, and relationship of the family with its own space transgress the limits of the houses or the apartments and invade the space shared by all, such as corridors, stairwells, elevators, accesses, gardens, and the equipment of the community itself, which in turn is insert and opens to the city as well. A fundamental example of this is the Unidad Vecinal Portales, built in Santiago de Chile in '54 by Bresciani Valdés Castillo Huidobro. This neighborhood unit was built on the Quinta Normal de Agricultura, and the site that were used for agricultural experimentation were transformed into this great and emblematic residential complex in Latin America. In 1954, when the Bresciani Valdés Castillo Huidobro office developed the project, it did so with the extensive use of long apartment blocks on a common ground, taking advantage of the margin of the co-ownership law. The 31 hectares on which the complex is built are no longer a lot of owners with single family houses as the neighborhood unit in the 30, but a large joint ownership, a common land shared by the 11,000 inhabitants who lived there. The construction of the community was an explicit intention by the institution that built the complex in line with the postulates that have been introduced by Siegfried Gideon in the book Architecture and Community, where the Swiss author highlights the role of architecture in educational process of the community. Murals and bas relief by the Chilean plastic sculptor Ricardo Irarrázaval were included in Unidades Sinal Portales, and the abstract figures proposed in the large structural walls of the complex had an educational role. They articulate the constructive dimension with the natural condition defined by the trees and vegetation present in Quinta Normal de Agricultura. The common space of the housing complex was the heart of the community life, the place to share and create a new society. This common space could not be anonymous, conventional and mute, but had to be to communicate, educate, and excitate the population. Today, 60 years after, Portales neighborhood unit is a renovated neighborhood with recovered common space with a central location in the urban area of Santiago, connected with urban motorways and metro station. Its area of green spaces per inhabitant is much higher than the standards proposed by the World Health Organization and higher than the average of green spaces for all inhabitants of the city. By comparing the pandemic life of the inhabitant of this neighborhood unit with the rest of inhabitants of the metropolis of Santiago, we easily understand the validity and the currency of these ideas. This project aimed to improve the quality of life of people by providing them with not only residential, modern, healthy, and well-built houses, but also spaces to make the great dream of community life possible. The word common is synonymous with sharing, and in architecture, sharing can be understood as the capacity to articulate scales, relationships, and the condition of the domain of public space of the city with the private one of the houses or departments. As analyzed here, the common space was an important project innovation from a formal, legal, and conceptual point of view that challenged the traditional use and administration system of the city. It was also a space of strong creative possibility, the place to which, in the modern neighborhood unit, the role of creating the new community was assigned. It was also a new space, not always well defined from a normative, legal, or terms of use framework. The modern neighborhood unit, if analyzed in retrospect, challenge the constructive possibility of the new materials, demonstrate the power of idea and the capacity of the project to build new imaginary when they are accompanied by political will. The most controversial aspect of this proposal lie precisely in their ability to build community, considering that society changes in times and architecture not always can do easily. What is known is that in most of them, the architectural and urban features have created neighbors with a strong identity from their initial years to the present. To conclude, if we understand that heritage is a social construction, a field of live, dynamic, and open conflicts, and not just a crystallized field of successes and exemplary situation, we realized that the great neighborhood unit of the second post-war and the great modern residential complexes are the reflection and the result of a significant and complex process of urban, social, technological, constructive, legal, and institutional modernization. It's under these dynamics and this polyhedral dimension that we must be understood, studied, interpreted, and eventually recovered. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, yeah, it was good. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Humberto, for your presentation. And I think we had a session that led us to various possibilities of the future heritages, not only but which is constructed, but in more of a conceptual way as well. Both Cornelius and Humberto touched upon these conceptual notes, whether the common that Humberto said, whether to address presentism, as Cornelius said, and also Nivaldo, as presenting how Brazil discusses modern architecture and modern preservation, shows how these conceptual fields are or not being pushed away or pushed further. This is what I mean. So I would like to start asking one question for each, and then we'll pass to the public questions. We have already two or three questions for Cornelius, and probably we'll have more for the others. So I'll just first, I would like to ask you, Cornelius, I was very intrigued by your presentation when you said that to address these future questions on heritage, we must probably overcome the idea of presentism. So if I well understood, right? And so to my understanding, and this I really would like to hear from you, presentism is a concept by this French historian, François Hartog, that in many ways, he says that we are living this presentism era. And this presentism era is one of the results of how we address heritage. We live in a heritage boom, because we are not able to leave behind our own past. So we are living in this constant present that addresses heritage constantly, right? Because we have to preserve our present situation. So this is a way the way in which we relate to contemporary issues. And I'm not sure whether we can just abandon presentism. And so I think it is more of it's temporal. It's a way in which we see the time, rather than something that we might choose or we are not. And if we choose this, probably our heritage future will be many different from which it is now, and heritage probably will have a different connection. And so this is one thing that I really like to hear from you. And even if we leave nation, if I well understood, so this would be a second point, if we leave nation and we leave the territorial basis, probably we cannot, we will be entering also another different era. And I don't see how we can detach ourselves from nation. Yes, it's probably one of the futures of heritage. We are all pushing away from it, but not from the territorial. So I would love to hear you from a little bit on this. And then I'll pass to the others. I think probably we can hear you, and then I'll just pass to Nivaldo and Humberto.
Yeah, thank you. These are two complicated questions, but I think the first one is slightly easier to address. I'm not following François Hartog's analysis in the way I use the term presentism. When I read it, I found that it just doesn't match with the thinking on these issues that I use. My starting point is a different one, and it is. It grows out of the concern that is commonplace in heritage today, that we are concerned with people, not with sites or monuments or artifacts or other objects. Ultimately, it's about values and uses of the heritage for people. So I think that's a starting point. And then on top of that, there's another issue that, and I think we saw Nivaldo's talk was also an example for that, or it referred to that at least, that there is a widespread concern in heritage that we want to preserve something for the future, that we want to list it and manage it in a particular way so that even future generations can still benefit from it. Right. And if you bring those two things together, then I found, and we studied this some years ago, that there's something missing in the argument. Because if we want to provide benefits for the future with the work we do today, then we need to know what are the interests of and the needs of people in the future. And at the moment, this is completely missing. So at the moment, people are presentists in their thinking. And that's not surprising because we are all presentism in our daily lives all the time. That's sort of the default position. And that's why it's necessary to become more conscious on exactly which trends do we see for the future. And it's not about speculating about some bizarre hypotheses on what may or may not happen. There are things that are very well documented, especially if we don't go further than 2 or 3 decades. And demography is one of them, and climate change is another one. That doesn't mean we know every detail on where people will live, but we have a view of the big picture. And this is, I think, the challenge that we need to accept. Also in heritage, there are already many other sectors in education, for example. This exists. The foresight exists in many fields. Business works with that. I know the forest sector plans 100, 120 years ahead. I work a lot with nuclear waste. That's a different issue altogether. But they plan 100,000 years into the future, and nobody thinks this is strange. So maybe that's not a model. Maybe we don't need to plan 100,000 years, but at least we should plan some years, some decades into the future, with the intention that we do the right thing as much as possible for that future. Of course, we may be wrong, and things will change, and have to adjust our strategies. Sure. But that's the name of the game. That happens no matter what. But we may as well focus on the important questions, or some of the most important questions, and that is to try and understand, anticipate what is at stake right now, and what could we do with the heritage, with the resources in heritage that we have. Right, now the other question on the nation, and now there was a question in here also in the Q&A. I realized how much that questions well, you could say the essence of heritage, because the modern idea of heritage is part of the nation state, and it's a connection of a joint history, a joint culture, and a joint political system, or common politics, and a given land or territories. And that's how the nations developed over the last 200 years or so, and are now commonplace around the world. So the notion of the land is integral to this idea of a national identity, and which is legitimated by the idea of heritage. Now, from a European perspective, which is where I'm based, we see already now that the challenges that exist for being more open and accepting more migrants from other parts of the world that are refugees in many cases, and that are forced to leave their home areas for a variety of reasons, maybe conflicts, but it could also be environmental reasons. Now, there should be a willingness to accept them, because there are people like us in need, and in many places in Europe there are resources available that we should share with them. Now, there's a large section of the population, far too large, that argues that, we should try to minimize these people as much as possible, because they don't belong here. And I do that on the ground of heritage, because the nation is defined by a common ancestry, and it's connected to a given territory, and the people who sort of are part of this story, part of this history, it's sort of more their land than somebody else's land. And that is a dilemma where heritage stands against solidarity and a more tolerant politics of this. So that's why I'm wondering if we could keep most things about heritage except the land, because there's still an awful lot. It still can be histories and many things we share, and traditions and so on. Just if we disconnected from the land, then it would be easier, I think, to be not just in Europe, but anywhere really, to accept in a given territory people from elsewhere, and also vice versa. It's easier to travel somewhere else yourself, and don't feel that you don't belong there or that you are a guest or something, but that you have a right to be there as much as anybody else. So that's my thinking. But of course, I fully understand that this sort of questions some of the essentials on heritage, the way it's been practiced and introduced in our thinking thus far.
Thank you very much. It was good because it clarified to my understanding this idea of European-based thinking and how it relates to immigration, and how, because the three of us, we are in the southern part of the world, so it's different. But I think it's really thought-provoking. So thank you very much. We can discuss it further on. Then I'll pass to my question to Nivaldo. And Nivaldo, thank you so much for this presentation. And I was wondering, because you've mentioned authenticity and how it is important in the Brazilian cases in modern architecture. And I really wanted to talk with you and to understand a little bit about how in Brazil, as we are speaking about future heritage, one of the main things that are questioned in heritage practices nowadays is, and not nowadays, but since the 1960s and 70s, is the monumentality and the exception, the idea of something being exceptional and being monumental. In so many ways, as we already discussed, to my understanding, modern architecture in Brazil, and the way in which it is preserved enhancing this author-based selection in these monumentalities. So when we look, for instance, at the UNESCO nominations, we see things that go beyond this monumentality. But in Brazil, and in many cases where in Latin America, the state parties, they tend to select things that are author-based, that have a lot of significance in the sense of a certain historiography of architecture. And so how do you see that we can move away from this, or we can move further and think about modern architecture beyond these ideas of monumentalities? Can we use the concepts of cultural significance that are important to UNESCO to select, to build value to this modern architecture, not only in Brazil, but in Latin America, because I know you are very much aware of the Latin America situation as well. And how does this emphasis that we see many times in authenticity in various restorations, if you could comment a little bit on this also, how this can be in the restorations that you've mentioned very briefly, but they are going on in Brazil and other cases. How can we address these issues of authenticity as well in the Brazilian case? I don't know if I made myself clear in the second question, but I wish to ask you about the authenticity, and how does it, if it does complicate the situation on the selections of modern architecture in Brazil. There is an overemphasis on authenticity. That's what I wish to ask you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Flavia. That's a very complex and interesting question, or questions. I think there is a controversial thing about how to restore modern architecture. Main restorations of modern architecture in the world are being held with rebuilding the buildings, not restoring them, considering technical and scientific concepts defended by UNESCO, set by UNESCO in the last 50 or 60 years. But with the reconstruction of these buildings, we can talk about La Ville Savoie in the 60s in France, and later La Villa Tugendhat in Brunner from Mies van der Rohe, just to name some of the buildings that are in the World Heritage List today. So people many times think the common sense is that we can redo it as it was before because we use the same materials, the same technologies, which is not at all true, as we don't use the same concrete that was used in the 30s or in the 20s. It's really different. The glass is not the same glass, etc., etc., etc. So this is one point regarding authenticity. The other point regarding, but in Brazil, the examples I've showed, I just showed some pictures, I could talk about them if I had more time. They mainly respect authenticity. New elements, they try to establish a dialogue with those pre-existent, but also use different colors or shapes. They are very interesting in this situation. This is the discussion that I think Brazil started 20 or something years ago. There are still the people who work in heritage politics in Brazil is still public policies, is still understanding that the authorship is the most important thing, the monumentality. But if we see Sesc Pompeia, that is maybe the youngest building to be listed by IFAM at all time in the recent years, Pampulha Church was listed with, only after 4 years of its completion. But nowadays, that we are only listing buildings that were built until the 60s, the Sesc Pompeia was listed less than 30 years, and Teatro Oficina also. I think Sesc Pompeia is a very living building. It's one of the buildings that has more significance, cultural significance for many different groups, social groups, as we can see also in Teatro Oficina, but more focused in the people who work with theater, drama, etc. So we have an example in Salvador that is not listed by the national government, listed by the state of Bahia government, but I think that should be inscribed in the World Heritage List. That is the Park School. The Park School conceived by educator Anísio Teixeira in the 40s and built between the late 40s and the early 60s. That is a revolution, not only in terms of architecture, of structure, of civil engineering, of modern art, but also about pedagogy, about education, about how to raise poor people in a very divided society with huge social issues to face. So the Park School is not listed by national government. Why? Because maybe it's not as monumental, even if it is. It's not as monumental. It's not signed by a famous Brazilian architect. It's signed by a local important architect. So I think you are very right in your comments on this. And I would finish provoking another discussion on authenticity, because when you brought Françoise Hartog, and all our discussion on time is like the linear time, no? The past, the present, and the future, even if the focus, the emphasis is sometimes in the future, sometimes in the past, sometimes in the present. But I'd like to bring another, as authenticity was reshaped by UNESCO to avoid a very strong Eurocentric way of seeing it. I think in accept multiculturalism, I think the concept of time in heritage should be rethought. Dina Bakum, in the previous session, she stated something. She's from Egypt. She stated something in the end of her presentation, like transformation is the great permanence in heritage, regarding the examples she showed. In Bahia, in my state, in my hometown, we have a category of listed buildings that are the terreiros de candomblé, the temples for the cult of Afro-Brazilian religion, that they are conceived, they are based in a non-linear concept of time, a cyclical concept of time. So the conservation of it must be thought regarding that. A building that is destroyed by a strong rain or by a storm can be rebuilt. There is no problem in terms of authenticity, because the concept of time is not the concept of linear time. So if we think that transformation is always present in the conservation of the heritage, maybe we should think sometimes that the non-linear concept of time, the cyclical concept of time, and the reconstruction, just to opposite this discussion to the beginning of my speech, of my answer, when I said that modern architecture is being rebuilt and not restored. Maybe in some categories of heritage, a non-linear and a cyclical understanding of time maybe is more important than the traditional Eurocentric concept of a linear time based on past, present, and future. I don't know if I confused it a lot, but those are some thoughts I would like to bring regarding your question on authenticity and on monumentality in modern architecture.
No, thank you very much, because yes, it addresses, yes, I will ask you just, I will pass the floor to you, Humberto, and you can share our discussion. But I think that this is addresses what Cornelius said about moving away from materiality in heritage. So yes, we have to think a lot about our the way in which the conceptual things are done. So Humberto, if you wish to join,
yeah.
Okay, please.
I would like to, yeah, please. I would like to refer to this idea of time in heritage, and the idea of Cornelio and Ivaldo about present. I completely agree with that, and it's if we consider in terms of quantity, there is a very wonderful paradox related with present in heritage, because in an ontological way, heritage, and it's an etymological or ontological way, heritage is related with what we inherited from the past in this present, and what we leave to the future. In that simple phrases, the quantity of the presence of present, it's very small. We only manage in present what we inherit from the past and what we leave to the future. The presence in terms of quantity is very small, but in terms of quality, heritage exists only in present. In that idea of cyclical present that Ivaldo said, heritage exists only in the present time, because it's in the present that we decided the values, what we decide, what we leave from the future, what we decide to preserve or to destroy or resignify in terms of responsibility. Heritage live and exist only in the present time. And I know that it's not new what I'm saying, but normally the idea of heritage is related with the past and the future, but it's in the present where we decide about the future of heritage, you know. And I agree with you. Thank you for the inspirational thoughts.
Thank you, Humberto. And I wish to ask you something also, because we share this common interest on social housing in Latin America. So I really wanted to ask you, as how do people see these spaces as common? Because to my understanding, one of the future, it is the present of heritage, although it's not very much used in Latin America, is that people indeed are called on to participation. We had a very nice session on participation, and this was really much discussed, is how people address heritage as their heritage. And in Latin America, as we know, this authorized heritage discourse it's pretty much strong, and it really says what is and what isn't heritage. So I was wondering how, because you shown the last slide was these people saying, oh, this is our heritage, etc. And what was it about? What is actually listed in Chile about these spaces, and especially how these common spaces, not only the open areas, the open spaces of the units, but how these places are shared and discussed. Because in the Brazilian cases, this is really one of the biggest problems, because there isn't really no state owned land on these spaces, because they go way back and they are really nobody's land. And this but people do feel that these spaces is theirs in certain cases, the cases that I've studied. And how does this goes in the Chilean cases? And also, we've been hearing a lot about the common spaces, and if you could see how this addresses to heritage, not only on the cases that you're studying on social housing, but also in the heritage field. If you could speak a little bit more about that, I think it would be useful for a discussion on future heritage. So thank you. Thank you very much, Humberto.
Thank you, Flavia. Yeah, of course. When I start to study the neighbor units, big large neighbor units, 15 years ago, I was much interested in the radicality of spaces, architecture, materials, that concrete and touchable stuff related with architecture and urbanism. And I 15 years after, I related that that kind of values related with the spaces and architectural radicality of ideas was strictly related with identity, identity and the strong identity that is there is in this neighborhood unit, that are completely different from the the normal context of the city. And I started to reflect about what is the common land of this identity, and is the idea of the common space. In some cases it depends from the country. The common spaces is related with the co-property, this community, and the owner of this common ground. In another cases, as for example in Argentina or also in Venezuela, this common ground is not a common in terms of property, but because it's public space. But there is also, in any case, a very strong identity related with these particular places. And what I try to do in this presentation today is to talk about the idea of common as a value. Today, if we consider that that idea, it's a strong and important idea for our society, it's another important and strong tool to declare, to defend them, to manage them, and to improve their condition today. Not related only with the restaurants or the maintenance of the buildings, but also to the idea of a society that in that moment was very important for the world. And that we have lost, with many, different kind of ideology related with, with the way in we stay together. Of course, the Biennale, Venice Biennale this year is related with that topic. How can we live together? And we demonstrate 60 years later that there was a particular way in which we built a very big portion of metropolis with this with the idea of common. In terms of declaration in Chile, more of we have in Santiago, we have 4 neighbor units that I showed you today. Very, very important. 2 of them are declared as a zona típica, like a, that zona típica, I don't know what the translation of zone, like a typic zone. but that kind of declaration protect only the facade of the building, the facade of the building and the relation with the city, but they are city inside, and what demonstrate that is that the tools that we have today in Chile to protect this particular kind of heritage doesn't work. And now there's an interesting discussion about a new heritage law in Chile, and one of the important issue is to generate tools and possibility to protect them in the best way that they need.
Thank you for your answer, and we'll pass straight on to the public questions. So we have two questions for Cornelius. So the first one would be from Juliana. It's disassociating identities from land might be inevitable in the future. But is this really a heritage field suggestion? I think we've already passed, but or just a pragmatic approach. Shouldn't we be here discussing how to resist that disassociation? And also from Juliano Carvalho, he continues to you, emphasizing common heritage, not specific ones, would mean focusing on major and dominant themes and forgetting minorities. I don't know if this is a question or, for instance, in Brazil, it would mean promoting soccer instead of Afro-Brazilian culture. It makes sense in avoiding conflict, but it also leads to forgetting and disappearance of non-dominant cultures. So yes, if you could, and there's also a third one that I will go straight on to it, and so that you can answer all of it. Do you want to answer these two from Juliano first, Cornelius?
Actually, I haven't seen the third one, but
okay.
The first two, I think I already answered.
Yeah, you've already answered, yes.
But if I may, I would like to make a comment on Nivaldo's suggestion with the time, the concept of time. This is not really related to the question, but I think it's interesting anyway. And I understand the argument, but I think that the problem with I would dispute that there are some cultures that have cyclical time and other cultures that have linear time. I think everybody has both. I mean, even in Europe, I mean, we're very used to like the weeks and the years and birthdays and generations, and it's like everywhere a lot of cyclical things. And at the same time, I think any group also plans for the next day or the next harvest, and of course everybody has children, and although there is a cyclical element to it, but there's also a linear element to it as people replace each other and so on. But I think there's a specific difficulty in the heritage sector. One is that, as was referred to early on, that heritage protection is motivated by the idea that something needs to be preserved for future generations. And you were alluding to this. Now, if you take this away, that things are cyclical, they can be reinvented and recreated all the time, then there's no need for preservation. And I mean, you mentioned that in relation to the modern architecture, that it's being redone. And that's exactly what will happen. And it can apply to any period, because then you don't have the fact that something has been created once, and once it's lost, it's lost. No, you just redo it. And that's one issue. And the other issue is, of course, with the global trends I mentioned. I mean, climate change, that affects everybody. It's not something you can opt in or opt out, or it's not that everything will be fine again in so many years automatically. This is a global story that in which we are all caught and which we need to address. And of course, something similar applies for all of these sustainability goals, extreme poverty eradication and so on. That's in everybody's interest. And all the other goals, also population growth, and which are global trends in Asia especially, and so on. And these are very clear linear trends as far as we can see at the moment, which I think we need to address in one way or another. So that has to be part of the story, at least.
Okay, so then I'll pass to the third question. That is from Maria Paula Armelo. In a multi-ethnic approach to preservation, how are the questions of value and authenticity placed? Do you see the question, Cornelius?
Yes.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Aren't we selecting one culture value in detriment to the others? How do you see globalization, social changes in relation to this approach to heritage as what is culturally representative? Some has no or very little meaning to others. If you could comment on this question about the values.
Not sure I'm fully on top of the question, but I mean, I'm not saying everybody's identical. There are many differences on many levels, from the individual to on all levels in the world. I think what I was arguing is that heritage always means to make a decision on what we want to focus on. And at the moment, it's very much a collective issue. That's sort of the story of contemporary identity politics, that we're talking about groups that are defined through different properties, and some of them are very clearly related to a shared heritage. That doesn't mean that everybody is identical in this group. There are still some people who feel more at home in part of the story than other people. And there may be people who want to change from one group to another group, or who are part of several groups at the same time. I think that's quite common. Or people who move either voluntarily or forced from one group to another. So all these difficulties exist already now, and I'm not saying that they will ever disappear. There will always be differences. The question is, which story do you want to put to the foreground? What is the story you want to see in having your own consciousness, but also see in museums, for example, or in other work that heritage institutions do? In maybe buildings that you protect, and so on. And there, I think one could focus on commonalities more than on distinctiveness, on differences, not exclusively, but it could be a more important aspect of choices, so that these things are become more emphasized in our daily lives. That's really all I'm saying. It's a question of emphasis. And not about eradicating difference or sort of suppressing certain groups. It's just which is the story you tell together in a given social context.
Yes, thank you. And I was wondering, it's not a question, I'm just thinking about the discussion, and I was wondering how this emphasis can be done when we talk about the immigrant issues in Europe, and because this is a question of minority in Europe, so this might be something I wonder about it. And so I will pass to Nivaldo so he can react of what's been said. And there's also a specific question for you, Nivaldo, from Maria Paula also. In your opinion, why do you think Lina's project for Pelourinho has been left abandoned, while other projects are praised as common heritage? MASP, Sesc Pompeia, and etc.
Thank you, Flavia. Thank you, Cornelius. I'd like to start commenting Cornelius' comments on the question of authenticity. I understand that heritage is for the future, but what is the future? It depends on which culture. Future means different things for different cultures. Its the relation of future with present and past is also different. I don't agree that of course, every culture has also the idea of a cyclical time and a linear time, etc. But it's really different the way, for example, the Afro-Brazilian culture understands the future, the past, and the present. The temple that was rebuilt after a storm, if the goddess authorizes its reconstruction, is the same temple it was before. It's like the Buddhist temples in Japan. It's not the same thing for a Gothic church in Europe or for a modern building in Brazil. Those were built under a Western conception of time, linear conception of time. So I really think that there are situations, there are cultures in every country in Brazil that is a multicultural country. We also have these cultures living the same space at the same time that maybe is not the same time. But also recreating is not recreating freely. Things must be recreating in a certain way. Europeans have established which way is that? Future is different from the past. Each time has its formal expression, and new parts need to have a different expression of the former ones, of the oldest ones. It's not true for the Buddhist temples in Japan. It's not true for the temples of Afro-Brazilian religion of Candomblé in Bahia. So that's what I'm talking about. I think those are different approaches to the thing. And that's a very complex discussion. I'm speaking in not my mother tongue, so it's really complex to debate this, but I'm doing my best. Trying to answer Maria Paula, I understand regarding Lina works specifically. I've seen that Lina's work in São Paulo has been preserved, and Lina's work in Bahia is not as well preserved. That's unfortunately, as a Bahia-born architect, I needed to state that. In São Paulo, maybe because São Paulo doesn't have a colonial architecture, doesn't have a World Heritage site, a historic center inscribed the World Heritage list, they value modern architecture in a way that we in Bahia, we don't. So in São Paulo, there are four buildings from Lina that are listed, are preserved, are being used, completely used, like MASP, SES Pompeia, that you have listed, but also Teatro Oficina, the Oficina Theater that I've showed you, and the house of the houses, the institute, the Lina Bobardi and Pietro Maria Bardi Institute, that was the former house of the architect and her husband. Those buildings faces a lot of problems, but they are being used, they are being preserved, even if there is a project of building two or three towers just beside the Oficina Theater that are very controversial, because Oficina Theater has its huge glass window facing the viaduct that is in front of it, the bridge, the road bridge, and it's very controversial. But in Bahia, the Museum of Modern Art is being seen not as an important museum, but a place to house popular music, pop music shows. Ladeira da Misericórdia is abandoned for many years. Fortunately, the Theater Gregório de Matos from the 80s was restored, and Casa do Benin, the Benin House, was also restored. But those buildings are not listed. The Museum of Modern Art is inside a listed building, but that was already listed when Lina Bobardi designed her intervention. So I think we are very focused in Bahia in our colonial heritage, and we don't understand the importance of preserving our modern architecture, especially Lina Bobardi's work that is worldwide famous, that is recognized. She just received, is about to receive the Golden Lion from the Venice Biennale, and unarguably is one of the most important architects, female architects of the world, besides Zaha Hadid and others, but undoubtedly one of the most important architects of the world of the 20th century, independently of gender. So I think we don't have discovered yet in Bahia the importance of having those Lina works, and also the fact that they are more recent, but that's not a problem, because Teatro Oficina, the Oficina Theater and SES Pompeia also were built in the 80s and 90s and are already preserved and listed in São Paulo. So I would say that Bahia has not discovered yet the importance of having these Lina masterpieces.
Thank you, Nivaldo. And I'll pass to Humberto, if you'd like to comment on what's been said in the questions also, because I think they might serve to you about identity and etc.
Yeah, I would like to comment the Giuliano Carvalho question about emphasizing common heritage is forgetting minorities. I don't agree with Giuliano. I understand what I think that I understand what you want to express, the preoccupation about that, but I think that what is very bad in for heritage is the polarization of the polarization of discourses. And if you promote common, if you promote, you know, the idea of common heritage or the idea of nation, you are forgetting minorities, you are forgetting the you know, local experience or expression of heritage. That polarization of the discourse is very bad for heritage management and for heritage in general, in my opinion. And I think that we should, as a new heritage approach, you know, we should make to give the possibility, of the coexistence of different scales of heritage, in different scale of heritage and different scale of you know, identification with heritage. In every part of the world, there are many well radicated practices, cultural practices that are not declared. You know, I come from Italy. In Italy, there are many celebration that in a specific place took place every year from, you know, 600 years. And they to be part of that small community and of the small practice of minority of heritage, they don't need to be declared, you know. They do the celebration every year. They don't need the institutional management of heritage, and neither local nor national, neither UNESCO or international declaration of that specific practice, because practices can be coexist, you know. And I think that depends from the identification of and of the population with that specific kind of heritage. If they don't need it, they will forget it, and we will lost it for, you know, maybe for forever or not. It depends from the present, what we consider, what we are do today.
Yeah, I don't know. I think this is a very interesting discussion, but the problem, Umberto, to my understanding, is that there's a lot of inequalities in heritage scenery. So if we look at the situation in Latin America and in Brazil, we have a little recognition, and we need all those scales of recognition in order to be able to leave things behind. And when we look at the minorities, as Nivaldo was saying, well, we have to understand differently how Afro-Brazilian temples and spaces that are not being preserved, they are menaced in fact, menaced in Brazil. These, we have to understand it differently to make it be preserved, because otherwise it will be destroyed. We cannot afford saying, okay, we don't want them to be preserved, maybe. So,
but Claudia, okay, but the problem that
I jumped into the discussion. I'm sorry.
Okay. The problem that we have is with the institutionality of heritage, not with heritage himself. You know, the heritage and values and the relationship between people with heritage, a monument, a site, or a you know, a practical of intangible heritage, is different from the management, the institutionality of heritage. You know, la Festa del Redentore in Venice, the party of Redentore, it was a very important celebration in that city many years before that UNESCO was, you know, created. And still today, it's a very important celebration for the people in Venice. And it's important to separate the institutionality of heritage and management with the heritage value, I think. And normally there is a overlapping and confusion in that, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, with this I do agree. Yeah, and so I think we are coming to almost to the end of our session, and I'll make another round between. I'll pass the floor to you for your last comments, but I would ask Cornelius. We hear most of the time, and in a lot of the recent literature on heritage, there is this idea of the Anthropocene, the idea of the climate change. This is almost common sense in the way, oh, we have to address this. But in terms of value, in terms of heritage practice, to your understanding, because I know you have a recent book that you've discussed this very recently, how does this, to your understanding, because you said this in the very beginning, how this addresses heritage in terms of value? If you could talk a little bit about it to us in short terms, and also to Nivaldo, you haven't really addressed the cultural significance question that UNESCO uses a lot. And there are people in Brazil that are really keen to this idea to use cultural significance to make phase 2 authenticity. And so I would love to hear you a little bit on this, and also to Humberto. Once again, how in Chile, in the current situation, there's a lot of tension, and how does heritage addresses democracy in Latin America and in Chile particularly. So if we could wrap up, and then I will call Monica and Vera to join in and say goodbye. So I'll pass to you in this order, please.
Okay. Thanks. I want to start by just connecting to what Umberto was saying, because there's actually a sociologist in Sweden who wrote some time ago that good heritage preserves itself. It doesn't need any kind of state structure or legal system or so. I think that's what he said. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it. If it doesn't preserve itself, then there's something wrong with it, or people no longer like it or so. I'm not sure that's universally true, but there may be contexts when it is true. And I think you gave us an example. But Flavie, your issues, values, the Anthropocene, and I also want to come back to what you said earlier about minorities and groups, because it's connected. What I see is a risk especially in the age of the Anthropocene, is that we essentializing groups, which of course exist. We make them, that's what we see at the moment. We make the group membership primary in people's identities and in their rights and so on. So at first you're a member of a particular group, and that of course means there are a number of rights that go with that and that need to be protected. And only secondary follows everything else. So I don't think we can afford that in the age of the Anthropocene and everything that is on the global scale at the moment. We need, I think, first and foremost, be aware that we're all human beings, first and foremost. This is sort of the overarching identity. We're all neighbors. And then on a second level, then of course comes that we're all different. We all have different trajectories and like different things, do different things, have different ancestors and different descendants and so on. Yes, we do, but that doesn't come before the fact that we're all humans on the same level. And it is that human identity that I think is being called on in our age, where I mean, we have meetings like this across the whole world. You know, this would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, probably, maybe even less than that. And now it's common practice, and it's perfectly possible we'll meet in person also at some event and quite soon. And we share so much. We read the same books. We are part of the same, so much of the same in the culture, and not just us, but huge amounts of people. So I think this is, to me, in terms of values, there are global values. There are values that we share as human beings, and that is a very important aspect. And another point on values is that the responsibility we see today in being faced with the Anthropocene and climate change and all kinds of major changes that are ahead of us, they require maybe new values than what we've seen before. And that's why I think when Umberto said that that we're preserving the past, no, we're inheriting the past and we're leaving it for the future. Well, at the moment, the emphasis is entirely on the past. We're inheriting from the past and then we keep it the way it is. And I think that's no longer adequate. We need to think about not just who were we or where do we come from, but who do we want to be? How do we want to have it? Who do we want to become? What should the world be like? How do we want to live? These are the issues of our age. And then heritage plays a role in that. But it's not what we inherit. It's not the given answer. That's just like at home. We inherit a lot of stuff from our parents. Most of it is not worth very much. Some of it is, of course, and that we treasure. A lot is not. And I think that's the same on a social level. So we need to create global values and face the challenges of the future and realize what should be the emphasis. And these are open questions. I'm not supplying the answers, but I want to have a discussion on these issues. Right. Full stop.
Thank you. I'll pass to Nivaldo.
I can't avoid, but I'd like to provoke another discussion. I don't think good heritage preserves itself. Maybe it's true in homogeneous societies, but in heterogenic societies characterized by huge inequalities, by slavery in its recent history, I don't think it's true. The listing of the first Afro-Brazilian religious temple in the 80s in Brazil was needed in order to preserve it, to preserve the oldest temple of this country, the country that would disappear if it was not listed, even if the activities, how do you say that? The religious activities were still held, but they were not the owners of the plot. So the plot the temple would be destroyed to build a building, an apartment building, the site. It was there for more than 100 years. So, and even if you think about the heritage of Auschwitz, for example, or other spaces that are not seen as, for many people, and as the common sense, as places that must be preserved, the places of torture in Latin America, in the dictatorships. So I think there are many situations in which the asset need to be preserved. It still has all its symbolic values, all its cultural significance, to answer Flavia, really strong, but for many reasons, social reasons, political reasons, and also economic reasons, it will disappear very soon, and it's needed to have an intervention from the state or from a group of people or from an organization in order to avoid this disappearance. I really do not agree, and I needed to say that Juliano Carvalho was talking about minorities. If this heritage belongs to a minority, it will disappear, even if it's still existing with all its strengthness, but it's not part of the common sense of what is heritage. Even in the 80s, when this temple was listed, part of the Council of the National Heritage Institute was opposing to that listing, and it was listed by one vote or so. And now we have 8 or 9 temples of this kind listed in Brazil. So I think things are much more complex than, in many cases, I understand, I agree that good heritage preserves itself, but I think it's more common in homogeneous cultures. Answering Flavia, I think cultural significance is very important. Unfortunately, I think the conservation of material assets in Brazil is still, the practice of it is still very focused in aesthetic and historic values, in monumentality, in authorship, in this kind of things. I think the values, the symbolic values, the psychological values, the affective values that people put in these assets are not very understood yet, even if sometimes they are understood, they are considered in the process of safeguarding. In many situations, I think cultural significance in the reality of the public policies of conservation of heritage in Brazil is still a very interesting concept that is not in the daily activities of conservation. I think in the university, it's discussed. It's like the theory of restoration. Every meeting regarding how to restore architecture talks about restauro critico, the critical restoration of Cesare Brandi, but in the practice, it's not used. People doesn't know that. So I think many concepts like this are very important, but they are very aparted from the real day life of the heritage institutions. As you know, you have worked in the National Heritage Institute. For example, the same architects that were preserving the heritage in Brazil were building modern architecture, but they are against the insertion in many situations. They are against the insertion of contemporary architecture in historic cities. The same, not the same people, but the same institution. So I think the situation is really complex. One thing is the concept discussed in the university, discussed in institutions like ICOMOS, discussed among experts like us. Another thing is the real day life of conservation, where I think that culture. I've heard an important person from the National Heritage Institute many years ago saying this has no importance, cultural significance. What is that? But at the same time, the intangible heritage is being protected in Brazil, considering all these concepts, the affective values, the social values, the symbolic values. So I think architects, especially, I'm talking as an architect, PhD in architecture, professor of an architecture, a faculty of architecture, former president of the Brazilian Institute of Architects. We architects need to learn from the intangible heritage experts. They are much more up to date in these concepts, in the use of these concepts, in the application of these concepts, in the preservation, in the conservation of cultural assets than we are. We are still focused in homogeneity. We are still focused in authorship. We're still focused in monumentality, as you have said. So I think cultural significance is a very interesting concept that we need to apply in our daily work, not only in researches and papers. I don't know if you agree with me, maybe not, but that's my point of view.
No, yes, I do. So I'll pass to Humberto.
Thank you.
I cannot speak, so I'm sad, but you are the panelist. I'm just the moderator. So thank you, Humberto, it's with you.
We will have time to discuss again about this. For that reason, we create this foundation, our heritage, to talk about this. And yeah, I don't agree only in one thing with Nivaldo. I don't think it's an issue of homogeneity. You know that in Italy we have 12 languages. We are not homogeneous, you know. And we consider the diversity as an important value, and that is the reason that in the valley, you know, in the north of Italy, they speak Ladino, for example, and you know, and in Sardinia they speak Sardo, and in Udine they speak, you know, we are not homogeneous, but we consider that diversity is the basis of our identity. The minority are the basis of our identity as national identity, and both things coexist in peace. I don't know if it's peace forever, but today is in peace. When, for example, when with the pandemics, many peoples in Italy use the flag as a symbol of identity. I live in Chile. I'm here. And and I go to the question of Flavia, after the social crisis that started in 2019, the basis of the cultural and economical and constitutional of Chile was started to, you know, to be redefined. And also the use of flag, for example, and also the idea of nation, that's not you know, that multicultural nation with inclusion of minority inside the new constituent movement, etc., etc. And in the I think that we have a very beautiful and unique opportunity here in Chile, in my opinion, is to put heritage, the richness and diversity of heritage as a pillar of the new constitution of the new nation, and the beauty of heritage in terms of take care. I talk that I don't know about, you know, tangible or intangible. Yeah, I'm not an anthropologist or sociologist. I'm an architect as you, but I know that heritage is to take care, and to take care and to be sensible with all these things. And if this feeling is the basis of to take care, the basis of the new constitution in Chile, I think that we will have in the future a good place in which to live. And that future we are building literally today. Today we are building that future. And I say we have a very big opportunity. No many humans have the opportunity to participate in a constitution. Not many humans in all the Anthropocene, you know. And it's fantastic. And ojalá, no sé cómo se dice en inglés, that the heritage will be the pillar, one of the most important. Yeah, hopefully the heritage will be one of the pillars of the new constitution here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is hopefully way of finishing our session with the hopes of the Chilean constitution. And now pass to Monica. Thank you very, very much for to all three. It was my great pleasure. We had a very provocative and intense discussion, and I think we'll have a lot to think about the heritage of future from this encounter. So really, thank you. It's been my pleasure. And I'll pass to Monica Schle if she wishes to say a few words and goodbye.
I just want to thank you very much for this wonderful session in name of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and all our partners. And I wish that we continue this discussion. I put this all the links for registering in our next sessions. And thank you very much. And thank you, Flavia, for this wonderful moderation. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you,
Bye-bye.
Flavia. Excellent. And good